Anyway, we're here in the studio now with Dr. Stephen Bright, psychedelic research in science and medicine. Steve, how you doing?
Very well,
Very
well, thanks for having me.
Steve, it's been a busy week for you. You were just saying that you've spoken to about 15 radio stations and done about 15 interviews over the past week.
Yeah, so primarily this is in relation to the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies being given permission by the Food and Drug Administration to commence with Phase 3 trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And of course, PRISM is a not-for-profit incorporated organisation which aims to initiate, fund and facilitate psychedelic studies, and our primary focus has been on establishing a MDMA trial for war veterans in Australia. We've come across many barriers in trying to get this underway, and published a paper recently in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. And so with all of this sort of coming together, the media were quite interested in finding out what it means for the Phase 3 trials going ahead and understanding what some of the barriers are in Australia for PRISM in moving forward with mounting an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial.
And just to quickly go over a bit of the same ground, but I think it's important, especially if you're a first-time listener. Phase 3 studies. What is a Phase 3 study, and why is this so important?
So Phase 1 studies determine the safety of a drug. Phase 2 trials determine the efficacy of it, and Phase 3 trials are large trials which come before a drug becoming a medicine. So if the Phase 3 trials are deemed to be successful, then it's highly likely that MDMA will be an approved medicine in the US, probably by 2021 or earlier, given the very positive results that the MAPs have been getting at the moment.
And what's going on in Australia at the moment? I mean, obviously there's you guys have been pushing for this for a number of years now, and there hasn't been much move, and a lot of that has to do with some sort of politics politics just generally. How are things looking at the moment?
Yeah, well, so we established in 2011, and I would say our movement has been glacial. The publication that I just mentioned is probably one of our key milestones. It's small, but it's a key milestone in that we're now engaging with the academic community in discussions around this treatment in Australia. So some of the barriers that we've come across have been academic conservatism. In Australia, we're a small country, and so there's only a small amount of government funding that goes into researching illegal drugs, and 99.9% of that funding goes into research that demonstrates the harmful potential of those illegal drugs. And I think some researchers and universities are afraid that if they support this trial, then it could have an impact on their research funding.
It's sort of well, again, this comes back down to something that we have to walk doing this show, where there's a fine line between this idea of promoting drug use and just honest conversations around these issues. And I think that that's probably the same. It's the same sort of fine line where people don't want to be seen to be promoting an illicit activity, which has been, the government spent millions and millions of dollars telling us how bad this is and why we shouldn't do it. And now we're seeing a different narrative, and some people are just feeling a little bit, I don't know, strung up by what's been said for all these years, and it's sort of hard to break out of. But are people starting to a little bit more? It seems like people are warming up to the idea.
I think people are slowly warming to the idea. I mean, a lot of the media work that I've been doing over the past week has been distinguishing between the recreational use of MDMA and MDMA being used in a clinical setting. So obviously, ecstasy may or may not contain MDMA, whereas the MDMA that's being used in the clinical trials is pharmaceutical grade, and the environment that it's being used in is quite different as well. In addition to that, if you think about most of the deaths that have occurred from ecstasy in Australia, they actually haven't occurred from MDMA. They've occurred from other substances that have been contained in ecstasy. So ecstasy has a bad name, and we need to probably separate ecstasy from MDMA and maybe even call it something different like empathy when we're using it in clinical trials, because that's the effect that we're primarily using to facilitate and catalyse the therapeutic process.
Could you go, I read a piece that you were quoted in recently, I think on the ABC, and it spoke a little bit about the actual mechanism of how the MDMA facilitates that breakthrough with PTSD. Could you maybe go into that a little bit, explain how and why it actually works?
Sure. So my background is I'm a clinically trained psychologist. I've worked with people with post-traumatic stress disorder for many years, and the typical way that we work with people is to provide what's called exposure-based cognitive behavioural therapy. And so we expose the person over and over again to the traumatic situation in a gradated situation, so that they the amount of distress that they experience when talking about it is at a level within a window of tolerance for them to for the therapy to be successful. One of the problems is people can become overwhelmed and they drop out of treatment, or they may not be able to talk about the trauma at all, which means they can't engage in that sort of therapy. So what MDMA tends to do is, firstly, it establishes significant trust and a therapeutic alliance between the clinical therapy team and the patient, and it also reduces the anxiety around talking about the trauma. It allows people to have a level of emotional openness, which allows them to talk about the trauma, and in doing so, they are able to reprocess it in a way that seems to occur much more quickly than that in that which occurs in CBT. I think part of the reason for that is, I mean, if you give someone with trauma enough alcohol, they will be able to talk about their trauma, but they can't process it because the prefrontal lobe's been turned off. The amazing thing with ecstasy is, or MDMA, I should say, is that MDMA turns down the limbic system, the emotional parts of the brain, but it still allows the prefrontal lobe to function fully, which allows people to reprocess the memories and file them away in the parts of the brain where other memories would be normally filed. What's really interesting is in cognitive behavioural therapy, what we try to do is often look for cognitive distortions people are having and reframe some of the things that they're talking about. Whereas MDMA seems to do this on its own, and people spontaneously identify the cognitive distortions that they are having, and they spontaneously reframe the situation. One of the most remarkable things about it is that MDMA tends to really alleviate people's survivor guilt because of the nature of MDMA, the way it provides empathy not only towards others but for a person's self as well.
Yeah, I think there was something recently. It just popped up. I only saw a little bit in Facebook, but it was talking about sort of our notion of self, how we put ourselves, how we understand ourselves in our minds, and that I can't remember what the article was saying, but it was really interesting. So it was just trying to sort of point out that there's a lot of problems, and that people need to almost see themselves as another person, but then have that relationship with themselves in a good place, because people are a lot of potential. You know,
there's a lot of aspects to ourself. And I think what MDMA allows people to do, and this is in addition to other psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies, is it allows people to sort of take a helicopter view of what's going on so they can see the forest from the trees. Whereas when you're
immersed.
When you're immersed in the situation, you are your thoughts. So your experience is your thoughts. If you can distance yourself from that and see what's going on from a helicopter view, that allows you to then look at things from a number of different angles and potentially identify unhelpful ways that you've been perceiving the traumatic situation and even the way that you've been interacting with other people.
Now, there was something else you've been talking a little bit about this week, and that's microdosing. I saw you were talking with, I think, the ABC about microdosing. And while we're talking about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, obviously this is specifically for people with traumas. We're talking about it being used for post-traumatic stress disorder, especially in people that have returned from places of human horror scenes, war zones. But there is a lot of potential with many substances to help people that haven't had to go through human hell, but may have had their own hells. There's all sorts of things that trauma comes in all sorts of different ways, and it's every person's trauma is their own, and there's no point sort of like having battle of the traumas, I suppose. But there's all sorts of things that can be done to help these.
Yeah, look, something I was really fortunate to be invited to the Beyond Psychedelics conference in the Czech Republic, and that was partially funded by the conference organisers and by the psychedelic community around Australia. And in addition to seeing how far ahead the rest of the world is in compared to Australia, which gave me a little bit of optimism, it was really interesting listening to Dr. Ben Sessa talk about his research, which he's about to undertake, which is treating people with an alcohol or other drug use problem who have some underlying trauma, not necessarily PTSD. And the aim of his treatment using MDMA-assisted therapy combined with motivational interviewing is that by addressing the trauma, people will then be able to reconnect with others, because even with a small amount of trauma, people find it difficult to connect with others, and so they may end up making a connection with an object like a drug. And so he's hoping that through the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy that these people with alcohol and other drug use issues will be able to improve their social connectivity, and in turn that will lead to some reductions in their alcohol and other drug use, and potentially positive outcomes in terms of quality of life.
I think I digressed slightly. I started mentioning microdosing as well. Now, microdosing, do you want to explain quickly what microdosing is? It's something that's popped up a little bit in some of the alternative media sources, so it was interesting to see it pop up in media.
It's popped up in some alternative media, and it's also popped up in some mainstream media. Marie Claire have an article in this month's magazine on microdosing.
Okay.
It's appeared in Rolling Stone. It's appeared in mainstream media.
Yep.
Microdosing is basically taking a sub-threshold dose of a psychedelic drug. Mm-hmm. So it's taking a dose that doesn't lead to the psychedelic effects of the drug, with the aim of improving a person's cognitive functioning, their creativity, their present-minded focus, and also their emotional stability. And the idea is that you take the microdose on a regime, so you take it every third or fourth day. And you do that for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 10 weeks, or there's no sort of determined time for how long you do it for, but it's not something that's recommended to be undertaken for, for a long period of time.
And this is generally something that's been explored in the underground community. I don't think, has there been any research into whether or not it's effective at what people claim it's effective for, or is it mostly just underground community?
At the moment, there's no research into the incidence, prevalence of microdosing or its efficacy. So one way in which we're hoping to find out some information around that is through the Global Drug Survey. So the Global Drug Survey has a specific component on microdosing. There's also a study taking place at Macquarie University looking at microdosing, but we really don't have data at the moment on incidence or prevalence. In terms of whether it's effective or not, really the only way we're going to understand that is through conducting randomised controlled trials, because while there's many anecdotes in the media and on Reddit and elsewhere on the internet, the plural of anecdote isn't evidence. We need to conduct randomised controlled trials to be able to understand whether the effects people are getting due to the microdosing, or it could be actually due to placebo effects because they're microdosing, so they're taking more notice of what's happening in their day-to-day lives and so forth. And in addition to that, there's been anecdotal reports of people having adverse effects, and so it would be good to understand whether it is beneficial or not, and what's actually going on in terms of the pharmacology of it all.
Dr. Stephen Bright, thanks for joining us on In Psychedelia today. For more information, of course, Psychedelic Research will post a link as well, and there's you can find out about all the things that we've been talking about, and get in touch with the guys at PRISM if you want to find out more that's going on. That's just about it for the show today.
Just want to